Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, with the Israel-Iran conflict now in its 7th day, the US President Donald Trump faces a dilemma. Join Israel's bombardment of Iran or stay out of it. This, as many in the president's base urge him not to drag the country into a new Middle East war. Hello and welcome. We begin with the latest on the nearly week-old war between Iran and Israel. Well, heightening tensions even further, an Israeli hospital in the southern city of Beersheba was hit by an Iranian missile earlier on today, resulting in the injury of 40 people. Well, that prompted the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz to say that the supreme leader of Iran can, quote, no longer be allowed to exist. Meanwhile, Israel says it has carried out dozens of fresh raids on Iranian targets, amongst them the partially built Arak nuclear reactor and a uranium enrichment facility in Natanz. Well, Israel, which launched airstrikes against Iran last week, fears that Iran is on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon. Well, although the US President Donald Trump hasn't announced whether he plans to involve the US in this conflict or not, he has repeatedly said his preferred outcome would be a negotiated solution.
They should have made the deal. I had a great deal for them. They should have made that deal. 60 days we talked about it, and in the end they decided not to do it, and now they wish they did it. And they want to meet, but it's a little late to meet, but they want to meet, and they want to come to the White House. They'll even come to the White House, so we'll see. I may do that.
For more, we can speak now to Jeffrey Feltman, who is former US Assistant Secretary of State and former US diplomat. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. You've served in a number of countries in the Middle East, North Africa region, Tunisia, Israel, Iraq, Lebanon, where you served as US Ambassador from the years 2004 to 2008. I just want to start by asking you, you met the Supreme Leader of Iran in Tehran back in 2012. Can you just start by telling us, how that happened and set the scene for us?
Well, for me, it was kind of a surreal experience to have been a U.S. diplomat studying ways to push back against, Iran's malevolent influence in the Middle East, to suddenly be in a private meeting with the Supreme Leader of Iran. It wasn't my meeting. It was the meeting of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. I had retired from the State Department, went to the United Nations as Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, and we ended up in Iran in August, September 2012 for the Non-Aligned Summit. The Non-Aligned being the largest grouping of member states of the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon had reservations about going, but really had no choice. So there was a large meeting, protocol meeting with staff from the Iranian side, staff from the UN. But after greetings, the Supreme Leader asked the Secretary General if he would like to have a private conversation to bring one aide. And the Secretary General brought me. So I was the so-called plus one, as you call it in the diplomatic world. So it wasn't my meeting, but it was fascinating to observe the Supreme Leader after having read intel reports on him, after having studied Iranian influence, having been in Lebanon, where Iran at that point via Hezbollah is playing such a large role. And it confirmed much of what I understood from the Washington channels about the Supreme Leader. The paranoia about the United States. I mean, he asked the Secretary General to begin the conversation. So he turned the floor to the Secretary General, and the Secretary General, in Ban Ki-moon's sort of tentative way, polite way, but raised concerns about some of the Supreme Leader's rhetoric, death to Jews, Israel to the sea, that sort of thing, and basically said, Israel's a member state of the United Nations. Member states of the United Nations do not call for the destruction of other member states of the United Nations. And the Supreme Leader, in a sort of quiet, benevolent way, I mean, he had sort of a benevolent expression on his face, launched into a long monologue about the United States, that he did not expect the Secretary General to be parroting remarks from the United States, that the United States was the source of all evil and chaos and unrest in the world. The United States was the one that was causing all the problems. And so it confirmed much of what I had understood about his identification of the Islamic Republic of Iran with anti-Americanism. He confirmed it, but it was an absolutely fascinating time to be there. For example, on the road to the conference site where the non-aligned summit was being held, there were posters, billboards along the way that had the sign, the atom, the nuclear sign, the atom with the electrons running around it, with doves of peace on either side of the atom to try to emphasize a nuclear program for peace. And this was back in 2012, before any of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration and others was yet even started. So again, it was fascinating for me to be there, and I have to say that there were, of course, also Arab foreign ministers who were at the non-aligned summit. Arab foreign ministers representing countries that are in the non-aligned movement, and they all knew me from my assistant secretary of state days. I had visited them in their countries. They had visited me in Washington. We had lots of discussions about Iran, and they, I think, were quite amused at this idea that there I was in Tehran in a meeting with the supreme leader.
Right. I mean, you must be one of a very small number of high-ranking American officials who's ever sat across the table or sat across the room from the supreme leader. I mean, what struck you about him as a person? I mean, you say a lot of what you saw in him sort of corroborated with what you'd read about him. Just tell us a bit about, what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, the sort of common understanding in Washington based on intel reports, based on analyzing media reports, based on analyzing his statements and speeches, is not based on knowing him personally, because again, the U.S. has not had an embassy in Tehran, operational embassy since the Iranian Revolution, and no one has met him. I hear that I'm the only former U.S. official that's ever sat down with him, at least since he became supreme leader. And the fact that he used a meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations on the margins of the non-aligned summit to deliver a very, very long monologue about the United States, again, in sort of with a benevolent expression on his face. The expression on his face and his words did not coincide, did not match, but it affirmed what we had thought when I was still working in the U.S. government. And it makes to me it makes the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015 that President Trump abrogated in his first term, that much more miraculous, that the supreme leader authorized his officials, his negotiators, to come up with that nuclear deal. And of course, then he did it again with the negotiations with Steve Witkoff, because the identity of the Islamic Republic of Iran is rooted in an anti-American and anti-Israeli ideology that he has to overcome to go into these negotiations. I think it makes it a particularly challenged now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you, because, I mean, having heard that long monologue that you said that the Supreme Leader gave when you sat down for those talks, I mean, presumably you had a translator, so you understood what was being said. Although I can't imagine he was saying any of this in English. But, I mean, when you then put the clock forward 3 years to the nuclear deal that was struck, I mean, and you tried to reconcile what you'd heard when you were in Tehran with what you said was, a surprising outcome, which was that Iran actually signed that deal. I mean, did you end up thinking to yourself that actually President Trump was right to tear up that agreement based on the fact that perhaps what you'd heard in that room made it pretty clear to you that perhaps they weren't all that sincere about it?
No, I disagree with the first Trump administration's policy of tearing up the agreement. I think that even if there were, as the IAEA suggested last week, clandestine activities that had escaped the IAEA's notice, the fact that we had the agreement, the fact that there were robust inspections, gave all of us more information about the program than was the case after the agreement was torn up. And that's also, of course, when Iran decided to publicly race for the highly enriched uranium that gave them the stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium, which is not good for any civilian purpose. There's no purpose for 60% purified uranium that would fall under the civilian category. So the abrogation of the agreement, I think, probably legitimized in the Supreme Leader's views and Khamenei's view of the United States, or it reinforced, I should say, the lack of trust that he had in the United States. I think now his primary concern is regime survival. And probably Pezeshkian, President Pezeshkian's primary concern is trying to deliver economic benefits for the population. I think, and that those probably coincided in the authorization to have the Foreign Minister Araghchi and others meet with Steve Witkoff, President Trump's negotiator, 5 times before the Israeli strike started. So I think that probably was the combination of the Supreme Leader not knowing what he was going to get out of the Trump administration, and Pezeshkian saying we got to show some rewards to the Iranian people who have been suffering under these sanctions that prompted the return to negotiations. Now I have no confidence that the Iranians negotiate entirely in good faith. Sure. But I do think that they had an interest in negotiations that overcame that Supreme Leader's antipathy toward Washington. So,
Ambassador, do you think that we wouldn't be in the situation we're in today had the terms of the 2015 nuclear agreement been upheld by all parties, notably the United States?
I think that we would be in. I think that. Yes and no. I think we'd be in a better situation. We would have a better understanding of what's next and what we have to do now to extend the deadlines and things like that. And the Iranians would have probably had interest because of the easing of sanctions to talk about extending those deadlines, perhaps tightening some of the inspections, et cetera. Where we would have been in worse shape, though, would have been the proxy network, because the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, did not deal at all with the proxy elements that Iran sponsors around the region that make such a mess of things. And they would have had greater economic power to support those proxies. So I do think that the resumption of sanctions on the Trump administration, reinforced by the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, put some constraints on how much Iran could transfer to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, et cetera. And we may not have had the Israelis may have had more trouble taking out the proxy networks like Hezbollah than they did after October 7th.
I would like to ask you how vulnerable you think the Supreme Leader and the leadership overall in Iran is looking right now. I mean, obviously some key figures are no longer alive. They were killed. They've been killed during the course of the last 6 days. Overall, though, would you say that it looks like this system of leadership in Iran is in a very vulnerable state?
I mean, that's the key question, and everyone's debating that. Does this precipitate some kind of change in regime in Iran? Does this receive some kind of collapse, Syria-type collapse? Well, the Iranian security services, whole, have not been hollowed out to the same extent that the, say, Syrian army had been before the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December. So I don't think that we'll see a collapse the way that we saw in Syria, and also there's no organized opposition in the way that the Idlib HTS-led forces were able to move down to Aleppo, and then I think surprising themselves all the way to Damascus. I don't think we'll see that kind of scenario, but I do think it must be extremely difficult for the Iranian leadership to meet right now to decide what it is that they're going to do. What should their response be? With something like 11 senior officers having been assassinated over the past 6 days, how would you get together to do the command and control and planning? So I think that there's probably a great weakening of the ability to respond diplomatically and militarily to what's going on because of not knowing who's the spy, not knowing how do the Israelis get the information.
I mean, it looks, doesn't it, Ambassador? I mean, just to pick up on that, I mean, it really looks like Iran has been thoroughly compromised in terms of the intel here.
Yes, I agree. And that must weigh on everyone's mind. How did the Israelis do this? I mean, it's an extremely sophisticated, impressive clandestine operation that the Israelis did this, in combination with the precision airstrikes. I mean, and the fact that they were able to basically have a drone factory inside Iran is remarkable. We can go back to the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in a presidential guest house of Iran. And this must make it extremely difficult for decision making in Iran now, because you don't know who to trust or what other information the Israelis have.
Right, and you know, as someone, just I wanted to ask you, because as someone who's served in Israel, which you have, I want to ask you, I mean, why, given that Israel is on this roll with its intelligence coups and militarily it does seem to have the upper hand here, why would Israel even entertain the idea at this stage of going down the diplomatic route and finding a negotiated settlement?
I mean, Israel doesn't want a diplomatic solution. Israel,
right.
I mean, Netanyahu has long, back in 2003, he was saying Iran was just months away from building a bomb. I remember, when I was at the UN, the very cartoonish bomb display he did when he was at the General Assembly one year. I mean, he has long said Iran's only months away from a bomb. I don't know if that's true now. If it's finally true that what he said, and he's long wanted a military solution. I think that there's no coincidence that these Israeli strikes started on the 61st day when Trump said he would have a deal with Iran in 60 days. So he's long wanted to take a military approach. The question and the tactical successes of the Israelis can't be denied. I mean, the Iranians themselves must see the tactical successes. They must see that their air defenses are shot, that they're not able to respond, that they look weaker than most people would have analyzed, and more certainly than they wished to project themselves as being. But does that mean it's a long-term success? That's the question. Can you stop the Iranian nuclear program militarily? Can you eliminate all of the knowledge that Iran has accumulated? Where is the carbon fiber being stored that you use to construct centrifuges? So you have to. I mean, it is remarkable the successes that Israel has had, the tactical and clandestine successes that they've had. But I don't know that this solves the overall problem. At some point, this could be the excuse for Iran to race for a bomb when conditions are right. That they could say, there's a parliamentary draft calling for Iran to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT from the 1960s, and that would remove the IAEA's role, giving us less transparency over what's going on. So can Israel actually destroy the entire program without some kind of diplomatic program? I'm skeptical.
But I mean, doesn't all of this make it even less likely that Israel would entertain any form of dialogue or negotiated settlement and more likely want to finish off what they've started and finish it off? I mean, it looks and sounds from what we're hearing even today, even from the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, that they want regime change, don't they?
I think they do want regime change, and they probably see regime change as being the best option for eliminating the program, hoping that another regime that would come in would not be as committed to spending billions of dollars on nuclear program when they could be rebuilding the country. But I think what Israel's actually hoping for, I've not seen this in any media, it's just my own analysis, is chaos. Is that you have the central government collapse one way or the other, and then you have weak authorities that have to focus internally, that have to try to reassert control. I mean, you see this in Syria. The Israelis have acted in a way to show that they do not want to see the interim authorities in Syria emerge as strong, as in strong control over the whole country. That they see that the weakness of the government in Syria is being an asset. And I think that they would see the same thing in Tehran, that a weak regime that has to worry about the Azeris rising up, the Kurds trying to break away, would be far safer for them than the Islamic Republic.
All of this presents a huge dilemma to the US president, who must be weighing an antagonizing decision he has to make. Does he get involved and join the strikes against Iran, or does he stay out of this? Because there are a lot of people telling him to stay out of this, not least leaders in the region I'm in right now, but also his own support base, the people, many of whom elected him to office. What does he do? What do you think he's going to do, and who's he listening to?
I don't know. I don't know what he's going to do, and I think probably he doesn't know yet what he's going to do, because it is a real dilemma for him. He was elected on. In fact, his inaugural speech talked about wanting to be judged by the wars he didn't start. So he does not see himself as being a warmonger. But does he then see Iran, when conditions are right, if the program's not eliminated, racing for a bomb? So does he by avoiding going in then contribute to Iran actually making a decision and racing for a bomb when the conditions are right for doing so, when this war ends? I don't know what he's going to do. I find it very interesting, though, that J.D. Vance a day or two ago had a tweet that basically signaled that the president has his backing. We should all trust the president in his decision making, making his decision. J.D. Vance was one of the isolationists, the anti-forever war people. And for J.D. Vance to be signaling to the MAGA base that whatever the president does is okay, to me, signaled that Trump is seriously considering going in. Now, the Israelis, you can imagine the conversation that Netanyahu is having with President Trump. Netanyahu is probably saying, look at our successes. Look at what we've done. We've taken out Natanz. We've taken out the research facility in Isfahan. We've decimated the air defenses. You can come in, Mr. President, and have the winning shot to eliminate Fordo, to eliminate the most serious enrichment program. You can go down in history. You can imagine this sort of conversation, and it would have some appeal to Trump. I think Trump recognizes when an adversary is weak, and he doesn't hesitate to kick an adversary when he's down, when he's weak. And he must see that Iran is weaker, and it must be awfully tempting for him to take out that plant. But the other side is that then opens up the gates of hell for our interests in the region. I would imagine the first thing that would happen when you have Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq going after U.S. interests and personnel in Iraq. I think that Iran would probably hesitate to go after some of the U.S. military bases in the Arab Gulf countries, simply because the Arab Gulf countries have since 2023 basically worked on a détente with Iran that Iran probably doesn't want to unravel as a first step. But once the U.S., if the U.S. could simply bomb Fordo and that would be it, and then say go to negotiations, that'd be great. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the Iranians will respond against U.S. interests in the region. That then has the risk of blowing the whole region up. Although, as I said, I think that the Iranians will hesitate in terms of U.S. bases in Qatar, UAE, U.S. personnel in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, et cetera, simply because they don't want to automatically disrupt the détente that's been in place between across the Gulf.
I mean, isn't there another option available to Mr. Trump? I mean, on the one hand, we talked about getting involved, him not getting involved, but isn't there another option where he sort of doesn't declare the United States is getting involved, but the United States is involved in a sort of more clandestine way, perhaps offering intel support, perhaps offering some hardware? I mean, isn't that the option that kind of pleases everyone?
It must be happening now. I can't imagine that the U.S. isn't engaged in terms of sharing intel, isn't engaged in terms of trying to help intercept the attacks that Iran has launched against Israel. I think, and of course, U.S. weaponry is already being used by the Israelis. So it would be a fiction to say that the U.S. is not involved now. The U.S. is involved. It's just not involved in a direct way. Now, I'm intrigued by the Israelis saying they have plans for Fordo, that they want the U.S. to get involved, but if the U.S. doesn't get involved, they do have plans for Fordo. What does that mean? How would that work? Are they assuming that we would give the Israelis the massive ordnance penetrators, the bunker busters? I don't think so. I think they're probably looking at some kind of raid that they would use personnel to break in the way they did with the Syria weapons plant back in the fall. But I don't know. But it must be an incredible dilemma in Trump's mind right now, what to do. He must be so tempted, but also understands the risks to his own base, as well as the risks to American personnel and interests in the region.
Yeah, and just speaking of the region, I mean, knowing the region as you do, having served in all these different countries across the region, I mean, how worried are you that this region that I'm speaking to you from now could be engulfed in a broader conflict? I mean, how would an all-out war involving the United States between Iran and Israel engulf other countries in the region? Would it?
As long as it stays between Israel and Iran, I don't think so. And you've seen the sort of communications that have gone out from the other leaders to Iran to try to distance themselves from the Israeli strikes, even if they're also intercepting the Israeli returns to Israel. But if the U.S. joins in, I think the risks are extremely high that the rest of the region can get involved. And it makes me go back and think about that presidential trip to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE that was only last month, where it was basically a celebration of the type of region where there's investment, there's shared high-tech chip development. You know, that the regional leaders, His Royal Highness the Saudi Crown Prince, the Emir of Qatar, the president of the UAE, all basically embraced President Trump, who embraced them in return, and talked about sort of a new future for the region and a new future together, where we Americans weren't going to be criticizing them over human rights, over how their internal situation was ruled, but we were going to build things together. What must these three leaders be thinking after they invested so heavily in wooing President Trump, if President Trump now, against their interests, decides to enter this war? I mean, it's very interesting to see how the Gulf leaders have evolved their thinking since the time of the JCPOA to now, where they have they basically, like Israel, opposed the JCPOA. They opposed it for that reason I raised earlier, in part because of the lack of any kind of clauses about the proxy network that threatened many of them, to now where they've decided that whatever they may think of the Islamic regime, the Islamic Republic, that their best bet for developing their economies, for keeping the region calm, is a détente. Most dramatically, of course, with the one that we saw in 2023 between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was mediated by China. And surely during that Trump visit, to the extent that there were serious policy discussions and not simply signing ceremonies and hoopla, these three leaders would have talked about their concern about a possible military strike against Iran, which threatens to unravel everything that they've been trying to do.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but we really appreciate you sharing your insights and sharing those anecdotes with us as well about your meeting in 2012 with the Supreme Leader. Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, we can bring now into the conversation Elliott Abrams, a former U.S. Special Representative for Iran under President Trump and former Deputy National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush, now Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. I was reading a piece you wrote a little earlier on in which you drew a parallel between the situation we're in now and a situation that also involved Israel, but not Iran, Syria, back in 2007. For the benefit of our viewers, could you just explain that situation you were talking about and why you felt that sense of déjà vu?
Yes. In May of that year, the head of Israeli intelligence came to Washington and gave us the proof that Syria was building a nuclear reactor, part of a nuclear weapon system. And we then had 2 months of consultations, U.S., Israel. And at the end of it, President Bush called the Israeli prime minister and said, we're going to handle this through negotiations, through diplomacy. We're going to go to the IAEA and the UN. And Olmert's response was, no, can't do that. If you're not going to get rid of this reactor, we will. And Bush's response to that was, well, you do what you have to do for your national security. The analogy I'm drawing here is that President Trump has been negotiating with Iran directly and indirectly. And it looked as if there was a moment at which he and Netanyahu, about a week ago, had this conversation. And Bush said, Trump said, we're negotiating. And Netanyahu said, well, we're going to hit Iran. And Trump said what Bush had said, almost 20 years before. Okay, you do what you have to do for your national security. The difference, of course, is now the possibility of American direct involvement.
Whether or not the United States gets involved militarily, and that's something we can talk about as the conversation goes on. I mean, you are building up a picture of the United States tending to err on the side of diplomacy and negotiation, and Israel tending not to. I mean, it doesn't sound like 18 years on from that anecdote you were just sharing with us there, an awful lot seems to have changed.
I think that's right, and it's probably built in. These things are existential for Israel. They're not existential for the United States. We are thousands of miles away and, of course, infinitely stronger than Israel. So these are significant for us, but they're not existential.
Right. So, I mean, Israel, in terms of what it does next, I mean, it's done quite a lot, we gather, towards destroying or severely compromising the Iranian nuclear program. They want to presumably 100% destroy it. I don't know if they can or not. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And will they stop there? What else might they do?
I think they will stop there, partly because I think President Trump will ask them to. As long as this war continues, I think the Israelis will be hitting non-nuclear targets. They've already been doing that, hitting military targets, for example, police targets. But I think if and when the final large link in the nuclear chain, Fordo, is destroyed, I think at that point the Israelis have achieved what they wanted to achieve and what President Trump wanted to achieve. You know, 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, actually June 2015, is when President Trump came down that famous escalator and announced he was campaigning for president. And in that statement, he said, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So he's been on this theme from the very beginning.
Right, but I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu must be thinking much further into the future than President Trump or indeed any of the rest of us. I mean, he must be thinking, if this same leadership and the same system of leadership remains in place in Iran, and they just go back to the drawing board and start their development process again of a nuclear program in the years to come. I mean, Israel is going to find itself in this very same situation once again. So surely Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want a negotiated settlement because he doesn't want his country to find itself in that situation. I mean, don't you think that's likely to be his calculation here?
Yes, I would say we should all want regime change in the sense that we should want a democratic Iran. That seems to be what the people of Iran want. It's more important for the Israelis. They don't want the regime to be supporting terrorist proxies, and they don't want the regime, obviously, reconstructing a nuclear weapons program. But neither does the United States. The difference, I think, is that President Trump is allergic to regime change. He just doesn't seem to think it's a risk worth taking because you never know what the next regime will be. If Iran were to say today, okay, all right, fine, we will have zero enrichment, we will not have a nuclear weapons program, I think that would fully satisfy Trump, though the Israelis might be more interested in regime change.
I mean, we've been talking on this program, and we've been talking actually all week about the dilemma that President Trump finds himself in. You know, does he get involved or does he not? But the bottom line is, does Israel need the United States to get involved? I mean, clearly at the moment, militarily, they have the upper hand, and in terms of intelligence, they've had coup after coup. Does Israel need the US to be involved?
The question turns on one word, one place, Fordo. This is the Iranian nuclear site built into a mountainside. They appear to have 3,000 centrifuges there. If that site is intact, that is the beginning of the reconstruction of the Iranian nuclear program. Can the Israelis take it out? Maybe you just keep hitting it with smaller bombs than the US has again and again and again. Maybe that would do it. Or you could try a commando raid, of course, and get inside it. But I would assume that now, it's surrounded by 10,000 soldiers, and that a commando raid is simply not possible. So it may be that the Iranian nuclear program cannot really be ended militarily without destroying Fordo.
Any clues we can read into what President Trump is ultimately going to decide in terms of looking at US military assets and how they've been moved around and redeployed in the seas and in the region around Iran?
A week ago, I would have said there's a 10 or 15% chance the president would do this. Now I think we're certainly better than 50-50. It's partly that movement of assets, though that may be an effort to pressure Iran into a deal, but it's also obviously preparatory to, or maybe, putting the ships and planes in place for a strike. But the other thing is reading the tea leaves in Washington. When you see statements by the president and the vice president, they give me the sense that he's really moving in that direction and is, in a sense, preparing his followers for a potential strike.
Who do you think is most influential in terms of shaping President Trump's ultimate decision?
That is a very hard and very good question. It's not the people who hold the big jobs. It's not the Secretary of Defense. It's not the Director of National Intelligence. It may be the Secretary of State, but it also appears to be two generals, the Chief of Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that is, and the CENTCOM Commander, General Kurilla. They seem to be meeting with the president, talking to the president, influential with him and the vice president. So it's really quite a small group, 4 or 5 people. And it's not, again, you can't go by title. These seem to be people he now has some confidence in.
All right, that's domestically. You haven't mentioned any international pressure or any international influence. And there are obviously, the majority, I would say, of world leaders that have been vocal on this issue have called for escalation, have called for an end to the military operation in Iran. I mean, are there any voices that you think will be particularly present in the president's mind when he's weighing up his decision?
Other than the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, my answer would be no. And this is quite a different story from Iraq. If you go back to George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq, Tony Blair was a really influential voice. They worked together a lot. Going back to the UN for a second resolution was because of Tony Blair. There is no foreign leader, I think, who has that kind of sway with President Trump.
But the bottom line here is the Iranian nuclear program a purely Israeli problem, or is it also an American problem?
I think there are an awful lot of Americans who believe that. President Trump has believed it now for a decade. 4 or 5 presidents in a row have said, we will not permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon. The non-proliferation regime since 1945 has not been perfect, but it's been pretty good. And the general view in Washington is that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, the Saudis will try to get a nuclear weapon, other countries will try to get nuclear weapons, and it will really begin to spread. Moreover, we've seen Iran support the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Shia militias in Iraq when they don't have a nuclear weapon. If they think they're protected by a nuclear weapon, what then would they do? So the consensus in Washington is this cannot be permitted.
Do you see, obviously Iran looks pretty isolated internationally. There are a few allies out there, and obviously lots of neutral parties. There's this new acronym, CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Can you see any of those powers, which obviously the United States views as hostile powers, somehow getting involved in coming to Iran's aid?
No. Their support for Iran has been verbal. They don't really have much military power in the Middle East. If you think of where the Russians are, what bases China and Russia have, they don't really have any. China has a tiny base in Djibouti. So they really would have a hard time intervening. And nobody really likes to intervene on the side of a loser, to be blunt.
Sure. Were you to advise President Trump on his course of action? A very difficult question, difficult position to have put you in. But what would you be telling him?
I'd be telling him, first, find out if the Israelis can do Fordo. If they can't do it, I would say, make a last offer to the Iranians to give up their nuclear weapons program and stop supporting proxies, in exchange for which that's the end of sanctions and the regime survives, with a threat that if they don't do that, they're in for much, much tougher times. And then I would advise him to take out the site at Fordo and then immediately go back to the Iranians and say, we're done. If you do not respond in a foolish manner, we have achieved what we wanted to achieve. Now let's negotiate again.
Okay, and you think a negotiated deal, would that be good enough for the Americans? Because you've already said President Trump would be happy with a pledge from the Iranians, but it wouldn't be good enough for the Israelis, would it?
Well, if you look at a situation in which the United States has intervened in that way and bombed Fordo, I think, we really, for better or worse, take over the situation and the ending of the war at that point. The Israelis right now are completely in control of it because they're the only ones involved. Once President Trump gets involved, if he decides to go back to a negotiation, I cannot see a situation where he reaches a deal, a no nukes, no enrichment deal with Iran, and the Israelis reject it. I don't see that happening.
Okay, so just to summarize and to bring this conversation to a conclusion, what's the bottom line? What is Washington's desired outcome here? Spell it out for us, if you will, sir.
Washington's desired outcome is a full and complete end to the Iranian nuclear program. No enrichment, no weapons program, nothing. Civil nuclear power, yes, but by importing enriched uranium and then exporting it when depleted. We will achieve that through negotiations, please. But if you really refuse to negotiate, and if you insist on having a nuclear weapons program, either the Israelis will finish it off or we will. That is, I think, the American position now.
Okay, that's where we leave this conversation. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Elliott Abrams, former US Special Representative for Iran under President Trump. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
You're welcome.
So, Iran's supreme leader has rejected President Trump's demand for a, quote, unconditional surrender. And this has left many wondering what the US president will do next. Well, the prospect of direct US military involvement in this conflict has exposed divisions amongst Republicans, notably in the coalition of supporters that brought President Trump to power, with many of them urging him not to get the country involved in a new Middle East war. But President Trump says he has yet to make a final decision. Let's take a listen.
I have ideas as to what to do, but I haven't made a final. I like to make the final decision 1 second before it's due, because things change. especially with war. Things change with war. It can go from one extreme to the other.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Amanda Makki, a Republican strategist and lawyer who joins us from Tampa, Florida. Amanda, always a pleasure talking to you. And we check in with you regularly on US developments. They don't always concern you directly, in the sense that this one does affect you quite directly, and that you were born in Iran. And I just want to ask you, as an Iranian-American, what's been going through your mind these last 6 days?
Yes, well, it's very sad. I did not grow up in Iran, but I was born there, and I was born in 1978, and we were, exiles. We fled, and we were here in 1979. So my recollection of Iran is very limited. I have gone back and visited since then as an adult, and it's just very sad because Iran really is a very two-tiered country in that you have the very poor and then you have the wealthy. There really isn't much of a middle class. So, so many people have called me this week asking about my family, and you have people that are able to escape and leave and go to other surrounding countries. And then you have the very poor, those who work for the government making less than $200 a month, that can't go anywhere, and they're stuck there. And unfortunately, you just think about the destruction that's happening in that country and what it means for the people who don't have an opportunity to go anywhere else. That said, I do think about when I did spend about 2 weeks in Iran in my 20s, visiting family and visiting the place I was born. I do think about how hard it is for women to have any opportunities. And I think about the 30,000 women that since 2022 have, just because they took their hijab off, have been either killed or raped or brutally tortured. And you think about all the things that this evil dictatorship has done. And that's why you're seeing all the Iranians, really rejoicing that there might be an opportunity for change in their country. So I come at it from two very different aspects, knowing that some people are going to suffer through the destruction that is inevitably happening and will be happening. And then you see also on the horizon a country that can be resumed back to pre-1979, the way that it was, and what that would mean, not only for peace in the Middle East, but also for the Iranian people.
Right, so you're the perfect candidate. I mean, you've got the perfect profile for this discussion. But I mean, is your family okay? And what do your relatives think about this situation, if you're able to say?
Yeah, I have very limited family left, although I do have cousins that are, around my age in the 30s and 40s. And, they've dealt with this all their lives. They haven't known anything different. If you recall, Iran and Iraq had been in a war from 1980 to 1988. So a lot of those like cousins and relatives of mine, they've just been used to war after war after war, hostility and the unrest that they have not only gotten from their own government, but from countries like Iraq that have attacked them, and now Israel. And so I think that they come at it from a very different aspect, though they are the oldest civilization in the world at 7,000 years old. They have had to kind of reinvent themselves and, come back from difficulties and challenges and invasions that they have experienced. So, my family is doing fine. They have been able to leave. But the reality, again, is just the challenges that this poses in the short term and what we hope to gain in the long term for a really beautiful and abundantly resourceful country.
I mean, if you spoke to your contacts in Iran and put this question to them, how do you think they'd answer? If you said to them, should the United States, or would you like the United States to get involved in this conflict? How do you think they would answer?
So, as you know, there's an internet outage right now in Iran. I believe it's been going on for the last 24 hours. Because I know so many of my cousins, again, my contemporaries in their 30s and 40s, have been wanting to come here to the United States to get out of Iran because there are no opportunities. Unless you are aligned with this regime, unless you have an in with the regime, you are on the outs. You don't get government contracts, you don't get jobs, you're not employed, you're not making money. And so people are wanting to leave the country because they want opportunities. One thing people forget is that this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's one of very few theocracies in the world. The Islamic Republic of Iran does not allow women to really work in those types of traditionally, female roles. Males play that role, which means women can only really do one thing. They can be a homemaker and rear children. It's very hard for women in that society to get ahead. Yes, some women do. Certainly they do. But when I was there, for example, this was back in 1999, I was with my cousin, who happened to be one of a handful of women selected for medical school that year. And when you look at how many males get into those roles versus the very small number of women, you see that women just don't have opportunities there. So because of that, and just sharing a story with you as an example of why people want to leave, and why people want to come to places like the United States to be able to have opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't in that country.
Do you think it's likely there'll be a change of management in Iran? And we hear every so often from the son of the exiled Shah. He's quite active on social media. I'm wondering if there's nostalgia for his era, for his father's era rather, and whether you see him having a future role in a future Iran.
I think there's nostalgia for a lot of Iranians. I remember as a child growing up in the United States, my mom really wanted us to learn Farsi, and she really insisted on that. And my father was very against it and was like, that's in the past. That country doesn't exist. The country that, you and I know, saying that to my mother, it doesn't exist anymore. And there's no reason for my children to even need to learn that. Of course, my mom, she was adamant about that, and I'm glad she was, because I am fluent in Farsi, and it is my heritage and my culture. But there is a sense, especially of those who had to flee, who had to leave everything behind. Someone like my father, for example, he was military. His father was military, not himself personally, but those were the first to be. They were the first to be killed. They were the first ones who were. Them and their families, them and also religious minorities like the Baha'is. And so for them, it's very hard to think back to that country and think of the good days that once existed. I think Reza Pahlavi wants to see that. The son of the Shah of Iran wants to see that, and certainly wants to go back to those days of what Iran once was. Obviously a very wealthy and opulent country, which was part of the downfall. Part of the reason for the downfall was it was a little too extravagant under the Shah. But resuming back to using those resources, having a wonderful country that Europeans and Americans and people from all over the world wanted to visit and see. Again, the oldest civilization in the world. And so I think there's a hope for a lot of us that happens. Of course, none of us wants to see destruction, chaos, killings. Certainly Americans don't want to see, I believe, they don't want to see soldiers, airmen, our military losing life, losing limb, to go into a country that really, has nothing to do with them. In their view, for a lot of people in America, they don't want to see that.
Okay, so just looking at the situation in Iran and the tensions with Israel, and working out what the United States does about all of this, because this is not even a week-old issue. It's only 6 days old. President Trump faces this dilemma. He campaigned on a platform, there will be no more forever wars. We won't drag America into any more conflicts overseas. How does he proceed without incurring the wrath of his America First MAGA base and, really dividing the GOP?
think the GOP is divided on this. I mean, if you look at the most recent polls, in fact, 80% of Americans don't want to see Iran have nuclear capabilities. Now, that's a different question than an invasion and an all-out military campaign, but Americans don't want Iran to have nuclear capabilities. And that's what President Trump has been trying to do. He gave them 60 days. He's mentioned that often. I gave them 60 days. They didn't do anything about it. Here we are now. So I think that President Trump will continue on his message of, ceasefire, wanting to see that negotiations could happen. Where I think you see a differing in the party is, the neocons versus the isolationists. And so you have people like, for example, Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, ran for president, certainly a supporter of President Trump, saying we need to invade, we need to get involved. That's the only way. There's no need to negotiate. There's no need for trying to make this work. Biden couldn't make it work. No one can make it work with them. These are people who are cruel, evil. There's a dictatorship there that will continue to pursue its nuclear ambitions regardless of what they've signed. In other words, we can't believe them. President Trump, I believe, wants to believe that there is hope and there is an opportunity to maybe sit down and come up with a solution, to negotiate. And so now you've been hearing today that, there's a possibility that you'll have representatives from Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, visit the White House, possibly. You're hearing conflicting things, but underground, you're hearing a lot of interesting divide between the Iranian leaders on negotiating with President Trump in the White House. I believe that is President Trump's ambition, is to do that.
Sure. I mean, he's got to listen to so many different voices with different opinions. And I'm talking now about really Republican opinions. I mean, put to one side the Democrats, but on the Republican side, you've got influential figures who aren't necessarily political, like Tucker Carlson saying steer clear of an Israel-Iran conflict. You've got Marjorie Taylor Greene saying pretty much the same thing. Then you've got the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham saying do take action. Then you've got Steve Bannon saying we can't have another Iraq war, not so fast, don't rush into anything. I mean, a lot of voices. Which voice do you think matters most to the president?
Well, I can't say which voice matters the most. I think that President Trump listens to all of the different opinions, and that is a sign of a good leader. Someone who is listening to opposing views, someone who's listening to similar views. And so you do have, again, in the party, as I said, you do have the isolationists, you do have the neocons. Who he ultimately listens to, that's hard to say. I hope that he uses and exercises independent judgment to be able to make the best decision. But I don't believe, and I have never seen in my lifetime a Republican president who is more of a war dove than President Trump. He is someone who campaigned on to your point, campaigned on not engaging in more wars, not dragging our members of the armed services back into wars, and wars that are not our wars to fight. Certainly, we've seen this with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky in their fight, and he has said that, he has repeated that. Iran's a little bit different because it's de-escalating a nuclear threat, denuclearization, if you will, of the country. And that's different because it poses a serious threat for the region, and that's what he's trying to stop and trying to prevent. So it is a little bit different, and I hope that he takes into consideration all the different opinions that he hears and ultimately makes the best decision for him and the country, of course.
I mean, if he's watching television, and we are given to understand that President Trump likes watching television, I expect there's quite a lot of debate, isn't there, in the US media at the moment? And I'm just wondering how the debate is playing out. How fierce is it, Amanda?
Look, it's dominating all the coverage. It was interesting because last week was, by and large, up until just about a week ago, 6 days, as you said, everything was about immigration, the ICE raids, and everything that was focused very much on the border. And immediately it flipped. In the last 6 days, there has been nothing else in the news, it seems like, except for what is happening in Iran and what Israel is doing and where the United States is. Is Israel going to convince America to get involved? Is Netanyahu going to be able to convince President Trump to get involved? And then some people say, well, Israel doesn't need President Trump. Israel doesn't need the United States even to be involved in this. They are handling it on their own, and they're doing a pretty good job. So I think there's just a lot of debate and discourse because it's been a long time since we've looked at engagement in that part of the world. And of course, everyone's a little on edge because of what's happening and who are the other countries. What are the other countries that could get involved in this, like Russia, like China, like other countries? President Trump's meeting with Pakistani leaders. And so where does that go when Pakistan is so closely aligned with Iran?
Sure. I mean, I think it's fair to say, and I'd like to get your comment on this just to sort of wrap up. I mean, foreign policy sounds like it's turning out to be the really tough one for this second Trump administration. I mean, there's a lot happening. There's the Moscow-Washington reset, which seems to have been stalled. The Ukraine negotiations, which don't seem to have gone anywhere in recent weeks. Gaza just gets more horrific by the day. I mean, do you think it's fair to say that foreign policy is turning out to be much tougher than perhaps many had expected it would be in the second administration?
Well, foreign policy is never an easy topic. It's never easy to think about a country sending its young men and women into harm's way, into another country to, for aligned interests, but certainly something that worries Americans, especially after what we've endured since 2001, post 9/11. That's always a concern. And to your point about other areas, other regions of the world, I think President Trump has engaged in these tough issues, and he's really stepped into these issues knowing they're challenging, knowing how tough they are. But I think a lot of people respect President Trump, and they're glad that President Trump is in that role and not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, for that matter. We want strength through peace, and that's what the president wants. I think that's what a lot of Americans want. But as you can see from the polling, 80% of Americans are concerned about a nuclear threat, the nuclear threat that Iran poses. And so President Trump is just taking on these challenging issues that, quite frankly, his predecessor and a potential Kamala Harris presidency would not have.
Okay, and if oil goes up past $130 a barrel, I wonder whether that'll make decisions a little more hasty from the Trump administration.
Of course. I mean, of course, that's always a concern. Gas prices are always a concern. And we're going into elections next year. As you know, we have elections every 2 years for members of Congress and the United States Senate. So, of course, that's a concern. And all of these things have to be heavily weighed before the engagement happens. And that's why I think President Trump really wants to see what he can do. Despite some of the voices in the party from the neocons, he wants to see what he can do diplomatically.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Amanda Makki, Republican strategist and lawyer. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Well, that is all we have time for on today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us tomorrow for a look back at the highlights of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.